Another case where subjective timing seems to go contrary to objective timing is the phenomenon called cutaneous rabbit. And this is one that you can try at home and try on your friends if you like. The cutaneous rabbit is a case where you stimulate the wrist, you give 5 taps on the wrist, and then you give 5 taps on the shoulder. Person has to not be watching while you do this, and if it works, what the person feels like are continuous taps all the way up the arm rather than the 5 taps here and the 5 taps up here. So you see the diagram of the objective stimulation, the taps on the wrist, B, and the taps on the shoulder, A, and the perception, actually I should have said on reverse, start with the shoulder and then go to the wrist as on the diagram, and the perception is that the rabbit is hopping down your arm. Cutaneous just means skin, and the rabbit is the hopping, the feeling of hopping. So thinking about explanations of this, we can think about the Orwellian explanation. So we've got some kind of conscious edit that seems to be going on. So the Orwellian is going to want to say that what's going on is in consciousness, what appears in consciousness is the stimulation. Consciousness matches the stimulus. So the Orwellian will say the subject consciously feels the stimuli in the order of delivery, that is to say, the taps on the shoulder, the 5 taps on the shoulder, the 5 taps on the wrist, and then revises it before report, to report the cutaneous rabbit, to report the constant, the continuous, evenly spaced taps. So that's the Orwellian. The Orwellian says that you revise after consciousness to match the report. Alternatively, the Stalinesque interpretation of the cutaneous rabbit is that what appears in consciousness matches the report. The editing happens before consciousness. So for the Stalinesque interpreter, the stimulus is edited before consciousness. The subject consciously feels the evenly spaced taps consistent with the report. All right, so for the Stalinesque interpretation, you get the feeling of these continuous taps, and then that's what you report. So the revision happens previous to the conscious experience. And remember, for the multiple drafts theory, Dennett says, no, there's no way we can tell the difference between these two kinds of interpretations. There's no in consciousness that we need to try to explain here. What's happening, according to Dennett, is simply that we have the taps and then we have the report, and that's all there is to consciousness. There's no in consciousness that we could somehow try to determine the distinction between the Orwellian and the Stalinesque. All there is are the stimuli and the report. There's no extra consciousness. As Blackmore says, there's no magic difference that counts as what's in consciousness. As I mentioned, you can try the cutaneous rabbit at home. There's a video on Canvas that shows some students working with this cutaneous rabbit and trying to get the phenomenon to appear. And you can do that as well. You can either write about the results of what happened. Did the subject get the experience of the hops all the way up? Or you could videotape it as the video on Canvas shows. And either way, you can post your results as part of your participation grade. In discussing this phenomena, Blackmore regularly says that we should give up the intuition that there is anything like a stream of consciousness. We should give up the idea that consciousness is a show, is basically her eliminativist position. If you are a fan of the show, what you need to do is to try to figure out how to explain the sort of phenomena that make you think that there's a problem with some kind of a show. And so we've got the homunculus, we've got parallel distributed brain processes, and now you have this conscious timing problem. These are objections to the idea that consciousness all comes together, that there is something that is a conscious show, and so you need a theory to try to explain what could be going on, try to overcome these objections. So we'll consider a couple of the theories that Blackmore mentions here at the end of the chapter, and you should think for yourself which of these theories makes the most sense to you. The first one is dualism, and the dualist says that there is this non-physical mind, and the non-physical mind explains these different phenomena. It's not something that's happening in the brain, it's happening outside of the brain somewhere, somehow. That is then relating, somehow interacting with the brain. This is the worry, the general worry about dualism, is to try to explain these interactions. So you have a diagram here from Popper and Eccles, who are the most recent neuroscientists who have advocated a kind of dualist view, and they tried to explain this interaction in terms of an intervention in the synapses. Remember, the synapse is this little space, neurochemical interactive space between the end of one neuron and the beginning of another neuron, and what they suggest is that the non-physical mind intervenes in the synapse somehow. It's not clear what difference the mind makes in terms of the synaptic junctions, but the recommendation is that's where the interface happens, at the synaptic level. And so you can, look at this image at your leisure and try to see what the different mental relations are and how Popper and Eccles suggest that this might go together, and how dualism can explain these various different mental phenomena. The second theory that we'll consider is a quantum theory of consciousness. And the quantum theory suggests that consciousness is the result of large-scale quantum coherence in neural cell microtubules. And you have a picture here of a microtubule, and the suggestion is there's a kind of quantum collapse in these microtubules, and that's what constitutes consciousness. Worry about the quantum theory, and this is about all we'll talk about with respect to the quantum theory, because it's hard to understand quantum theory. It's hard to understand how quantum theory applies in this case, how the collapse of the microtubules actually makes someone conscious, and the general objection to quantum theory is that it's just substituting one mystery for another. That quantum theory is mysterious, consciousness is mysterious, maybe they go together in some way in being mysteries together. But that doesn't really help us in terms of explaining either one. So, so we won't spend very much time on the quantum theory. If you're interested, then I can point you to different articles about the quantum theory and how it's supposed to be an explanation. You can consider that for an essay if you want to discuss it, but we won't talk about it much in this class because it's not really a very strong contender, in my view, towards explaining consciousness. The next two theories we will talk about more. The higher order representation theory is the argument that consciousness is a matter of a higher order representation of a lower order state. So in the diagram here, what you have is a red flash. That's an external stimulus that's happening, and that then causes a sensation of a red flash. And so I have a little word in the back of the brain depicted there, sensation of the red flash. So back in your occipital cortex, that's where the processing of the red flash is happening. That's not necessarily going to be conscious. Remember back when we were talking about blind sight, we had, occipital cortex stimulation happening without any conscious experience of that processing. Similarly, with binocular rivalry, you had occipital processing without conscious representation, consciousness of that sensation. So simply having occipital sensations, occipital activation is not sufficient for consciousness. So what's extra is the question. According to the higher order representation theory, what's extra is that you have an additional higher order representation, and this is represented in the frontal lobe. It says, I am seeing a red flash. So in the frontal lobe is where higher order processing happens, and according to the higher order representation theory, you have some activation going on in the frontal lobe that is representing your sensation. You are having a representation of that sensation, and that's what makes the sensation conscious. So according to the higher representation theory, what it is to be conscious is for a mental state M, that's the sensation. It's conscious when there is a higher order state about M, when you have this frontal activation that's about the lower order state. And the arrows there indicate representation. So your higher order state is representing, it's not causing the sensation, but it's representing the sensation. And the sensation is representing the red flash. So the red flash causes you to have the sensation, but the sensation then represents that red flash. So representation relations here are explaining consciousness. An objection to the higher order representation theory is that it's confusing access consciousness with phenomenal consciousness. So here we have to go back to Ned Block's distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness. And according to Ned Block, access consciousness is an ability to report a stimulus or report a state, a thought or a sensation. And that's different from having the experience, from there being something that it's like to have that experience. And according to Ned Block, his objection to the higher order theory is that the higher order theory is about reportability. When you have this higher order state, you can say, yes, I am conscious of this, I'm not conscious of that. But you might be conscious of things that you can't report. If you look around the room right now, there are lots of things going on, only some of which you're going to be able to actually report about, arguably. If you think that consciousness is a show, you're going to think that there's something that it's like to be you that goes beyond report. So this is one objection to the higher order representation theory. The next theory that we'll talk about, and we'll talk about this more in the next class, is the global workspace theory. According to the global workspace theory, there is some workspace, which is a computer architecture term. That is a space where work gets done, where different modules can feed into the workspace, and the workspace then is a space where things come together. And so the global workspace theory of consciousness argues that there's a similar thing going on in your brain, and what's going on is that these different information modules are integrated into the global workspace, and then that information is broadcast to the rest of the system. So in the diagram here, we have the global workspace as a kind of center. That's not a center in terms of the brain. That's simply the way in which these different modules are integrating the information. And the information is coming from long-term memory, coming from the evaluative system, so emotion and so forth, and the attentional systems, and the perceptual systems. So you're getting information from these different modules that are processing this information in a parallel and distributed way, and they are coming together in the global workspace. And we'll talk more about what that coming together means, like how the global workspace theory can talk about the way in which the stimuli stay in their various brain areas but still can be unified to be integrated into a workspace. And then that information in the workspace then is sent out to the motor areas for broadcasting, so that everybody knows all the different brain areas that are processing information are all on the same page in terms of what's in consciousness. An objection to the global workspace theory is that it's still not solving the hard problem. It doesn't explain why information in the global workspace is conscious. Why couldn't all of this be done in the dark, is how Chalmers would talk about it. Why do you need to have consciousness in order to integrate information and relay it in this sort of way? Lots of information can be integrated unconsciously, and so there's a question about why some information is integrated into a global workspace and other information just does its job without being conscious. So this is a worry that the global workspace theory needs to respond to. So these are several different theories about how to explain consciousness in terms of the parallel distributed processing and in terms of these conscious timing issues. So think for yourself about which theory might be the best theory. theory in terms of explaining these different aspects of consciousness if you are an advocate of a conscious show. Alternatively, you could look at the conscious timing studies of Libet and the Cutaneous rabbit and say, look, this clearly supports a multiple drafts theory of consciousness, that there is no show, it really is just a story. All we have are the different stimulations, the sensory processing, the attention, the memory. There's no extra thing that's consciousness. We just, whatever gets fame in the brain, whatever achieves cerebral celebrity gets reported, remembered, that's all that counts as consciousness. So different ways of looking at these phenomena, and think for yourself about which sort of theory best satisfies the way you think about consciousness.